My son-in-law told me to hand over the deed to my house or find somewhere else to live by the end of the month. So I made him a cup of coffee, smiled, and started making calls he never knew about. I was deadheading the roses on the front porch when my daughter pulled into the driveway. That part was normal. What wasn't normal was the way she got out of the car. Door swung wide, heels hitting the pavement hard, that particular set to her jaw she gets when she's already decided how a conversation is going to end. My son-in-law got out on the other side. He was wearing his good jacket on a Tuesday afternoon, which told me everything I needed to know before either of them said a word. I set down my garden shears. I waited. My daughter didn't hug me. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps and said, "Mom, we need to talk inside." Not a question. My son-in-law was already looking past me at the house, the way people look at something they're calculating the value of. Inside, I offered coffee. My son-in-law said no. My daughter said nothing. They sat on my couch, the couch I'd reupholstered twice, the one my late husband fell asleep on every Sunday afternoon for 31 years. And my son-in-law opened a leather portfolio he brought in from the car. He said, "Gloria, we've been talking. The restaurant expansion needs capital. We've looked at every option." He paused like he was giving me time to prepare. "We need you to sign the house over to us. It'll go as collateral for the SBA loan. Once the second location opens, the equity comes back to you. It's a temporary arrangement." I looked at my daughter. She was staring at the coffee table. I said, "How much is the loan?" He said, $380,000. I said, "And the house is collateral." He said, "It's the cleanest solution. The bank needs an asset." My daughter finally looked up. She said, "Mom, you're not using it for anything. You're here alone. The house is just sitting." Just sitting. 34 years of mortgage payments. The summers I worked overtime at the school district to keep up when the interest rate adjusted. The winter I didn't replace my own coat so I could get the roof redone before it got worse. Just sitting. I asked when they needed an answer. My son-in-law said, "Sooner than later. The loan application window closes." My daughter said, "We wouldn't ask if we had another option." But that was the thing. They hadn't asked. They'd informed. There's a difference, and I felt it the way you feel cold air coming in under a door. Not dramatic, just persistent and impossible to ignore. I told them I'd think about it. My son-in-law looked like he wanted to push further, but my daughter put her hand on his arm. They left 20 minutes later. I stood at the window and watched the car back out of the driveway, and I thought about the fact that my daughter had not once looked me in the eye. I want to be honest about something because this story doesn't make sense without it. My daughter wasn't always this way. There was a version of her I raised as stubborn, yes, but fair, funny, the kind of girl who brought stray animals home and argued with teachers when she thought something was unjust. I loved that version fiercely. What happened between that girl and the woman on my couch is a story that took years to write, and most of those years had his name on them. My son-in-law came into our lives when my daughter was 32. She'd been independent until then, her own apartment, her own job in marketing, her own circle of friends I actually liked. He arrived with energy and ideas and the particular confidence of a man who had never really failed at anything yet. He wanted to open a restaurant. My daughter believed in him, the way young people believe in things when love is still new enough to feel like proof. I was cautious. Not cruel, cautious. I asked questions. What was his restaurant experience? What was his restaurant experience? What were the projections? Did he have investors beyond family? He answered everything with more energy, which I learned over time was his way of not actually answering. My daughter told me later that I had been cold to him at the beginning. I think what she meant was that I hadn't been immediately convinced. The restaurant opened 4 years ago. It did well enough. Then it needed to do better. And better required expansion. And expansion required capital. And capital, apparently, required my house. The first time he'd mentioned the idea of using the house, it had been casual, almost offhand. He'd said something at Christmas dinner about how much equity I must have built up. What a shame it was just sitting there idle. I'd let it pass. The second time was a phone call a few months later, more direct, framed as a question. I'd said I wasn't interested and changed the subject. Both of us had pretended that was the end of it. It wasn't the end of it. I hadn't talked to my late husband in 6 years, not in any literal sense, but I talked to him that evening after my daughter left. I stood in the kitchen where his coffee mug still sat on the second shelf, the one with the chipped handle. I couldn't bring myself to throw away, and I said out loud, "Raymond, I think we have a problem." He'd been the planner between us. I was practical. He was strategic. He used to say the difference was that I solved problems in front of me while he solved problems that hadn't arrived yet. When he got his diagnosis, the planning kicked into a different gear. He spent his last 2 years making sure I would be protected from things neither of us could name yet. I hadn't fully understood it then. I was starting to understand it now. I went to find a particular folder. If you've ever lived through something that made you feel like the walls of a familiar place had become unfamiliar, if you know what it's like to be spoken to in your own home like you're a problem to be managed, then you know why I'm telling this story. Not for sympathy, because silence is a room that can collapse on you if you stay in it too long. I want to say something here to anyone still listening. Stay with me. The folder was in the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, third drawer behind the tax returns. Raymond had labeled it in his careful block printing, property and protection. I'd looked at it once after the funeral, felt too overwhelmed to read it carefully, and filed it back. That was 6 years ago. I sat at the kitchen table and opened it. Inside was a letter in his handwriting. Not long. He wasn't a man of many words when few would do. It said, "Gloria, if anyone ever pressures you about this house, family included, call Walter before you do anything else. He knows what to do. Everything is already in place. Walter Okafor." Raymond's attorney for the last 15 years of his life. I had his card in my address book, hadn't called it since the estate settled. I called him the next morning. The pressure when it came back came faster than I expected. 2 days after that first conversation on my porch, my son-in-law showed up alone. My daughter wasn't with him, which felt significant. He sat in the kitchen and talked about the loan timeline and the bank's requirements, and somewhere in the middle of it, he said, "Gloria, I want to be straight with you. If we can't secure this loan, the restaurant goes under. I need you to understand what that means for your daughter." I said, "It means she'd have to find another job." He looked at me like I'd said something stupid. He said, "It means she loses everything she's put into this. Her reputation, her work, our future." I said, "Her work." He didn't catch the emphasis. He stayed for an hour. He talked about market timing and investor confidence and the way opportunity windows close and don't reopen. He mentioned twice that other family members had contributed. He mentioned once, almost as a footnote, that he'd spoken to a real estate attorney about the process of property transfer and it was, quote, "simpler than people think." After he left, I wrote down everything he'd said. Specifics. Dates. I put it in an envelope. My daughter called that evening and said, "Mom, I know Philip can come on strong, but he's right about the timeline." She paused. "I just need you to trust me." I said, "I do trust you." She said, "Then help us." There's a particular kind of heartbreak in hearing your child use your love as a lever. I'd like to say I handled it cleanly. I didn't. I sat with the phone in my hand after we hung up, and I let myself feel it. The grief of watching someone you raised become someone who would use that word at you that way. Trust me. As though trust was something she was owed regardless of how she was asking for it. I called Walter the next day and told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "They don't know about the trust." I said, "No." I didn't know about it either, not really. He said, "Raymond spent a lot of time on this. Let me send you the relevant documents. Read everything, then come in." The documents arrived by email that evening. I read them at the kitchen table with my reading glasses and a pot of tea, and for the first time in a week, the tightness in my chest started to ease. Raymond had placed the house in an irrevocable trust 11 years ago, 2 years before his diagnosis, back when the word diagnosis hadn't entered our lives yet. He'd done it because he was Raymond, because he thought around corners. The trust named me as beneficiary and sole occupant for the duration of my life. It also named a local land conservancy as successor, with a specific clause that Walter had helped draft. The clause stated, if any party exerted financial pressure, coercive behavior, or fraudulent inducement in an attempt to transfer, encumber, or acquire the property while I was living, the trust would activate a secondary provision immediately, revoking any and all inheritance interest held by family beneficiaries and transferring management to the conservancy, bypassing probate entirely. In plain language, the house could never be used as collateral. It wasn't mine to sign over. Not legally, not without dismantling the trust, which required a court proceeding I had every right to block. And if anyone tried to pressure me into attempting that, they lost everything Raymond had set aside for them. There were phone records. There were emails. There was my son-in-law's voicemail from 3 days prior, still sitting in my phone, where he had said clearly, in his own voice, that failure to cooperate would mean I'd need to consider other living arrangements. I brought the phone to Walter's office the following week. I want to pause here for a moment. If what I'm describing makes you angry, if it makes something rise up in you, hold on to that feeling. Too many women my age are taught that the polite thing to do is smooth it over. To be reasonable, to keep the peace, even when keeping the peace means losing the ground beneath your feet. Raymond knew something I'd always known but had never acted on, that preparation is not the same as expectation. You can love your children fully and still understand that love doesn't make people incapable of making terrible choices. Stay with me. The week I went to Walter's office, my son-in-law called 3 times. My daughter called twice. The second call from my daughter was longer. She cried, which she rarely does, and said she was scared the restaurant wouldn't survive and that she didn't know what she'd do. I listened. I said I was sorry she was scared. I didn't say anything about the trust. I had learned by then that silence is not the same as agreement. I had spent too many years using it as one. On a Thursday afternoon, Walter sent the formal letters, one to my son-in-law's business address, one to my daughter. The letters outlined the trust's existence, the irrevocability of its protections, and the activation of the secondary provision based on documented evidence of coercive contact. My son-in-law called within 2 hours. His voice had changed. The confidence was still there but thinner, stretched over something I recognized as panic. He said, "Gloria, this is a misunderstanding. Nobody was threatening you." We were having a conversation. I said, "You told me to consider other living arrangements." He said that was hypothetical. I said, "Walter has the voicemail." The call ended shortly after. My daughter called that evening. She was quieter than I'd ever heard her. She asked if this was really what I wanted. I said I hadn't wanted any of it. Not the loan, not the pressure, not the conversation we were having. She said she hadn't meant for things to go this far. I believed part of that was true. I also knew that partial truth wasn't the same as full accountability. I said, "I need you to understand that the house was never something I could give you. It was never mine to give in the way you are asking. Your father made sure of that, and I'm starting to think he was wiser than either of us gave him credit for." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He always did think further ahead than us." That was the most honest thing she'd said in months. The restaurant loan fell through, which is what happens when collateral evaporates. My son-in-law spent several weeks trying to find alternative financing, from what I heard secondhand through a neighbor whose daughter knew my daughter. The second location didn't open. The original location continued, smaller and quieter, which might actually suit it better. I'd always thought they tried to grow too fast. My daughter and I didn't speak for 6 weeks. That was hard in a way that's difficult to describe. Not dramatic, just a persistent ache, like weather you can't dress properly for. I thought about her every day. I missed her in specific ways, the way she laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, the way she always remembered to ask about people by name. She called on a Sunday morning in October. She asked if she could come for coffee. I said yes. She came alone. We sat on the back porch because the light was good out there and neither of us wanted to be inside for that conversation. She apologized. Not in the sweeping general way that asks you to accept something without specifics, but carefully. She named the things she'd done, the language she'd used, the way she'd let her husband frame me as an obstacle instead of her mother. She said she'd spent the 6 weeks thinking about what her father would have said to her. I told her that I hadn't done this to hurt her. I told her that I had spent 30 years making sure she would never have to worry about losing a home, and that the cruelest irony was that the same thing I'd built to protect her had become the thing she was trying to take. She said, "I know, Mom." I poured more coffee. The light moved across the yard the way it does in October, long and a little golden, the way it always did when Raymond used to rake leaves out there on Saturday mornings. I thought about how much can change in a year, and how much stays exactly the same. I am not a woman who believes everything resolves neatly. My daughter and I are careful with each other now, the way you're careful with a healed bone. Not fragile, but aware. We're rebuilding something. I don't know what shape it will take, but she calls on Sundays, and she asks about the roses, and she says her father's name out loud sometimes when she's remembering something, which tells me she's thinking about what he would have wanted for us both. My son-in-law and I don't have much to say to each other. He's polite at the holidays. I am polite back. That may be the full extent of what we're capable of, and I've decided that's acceptable. What I want to say, and I want to say it plainly because I've earned plainness at 67 years old, is that the house didn't matter because of the house. It mattered because of what it represented. It was the record of a life. It was the proof that I had shown up year after year and done the hard work of building something. It was 34 years of a man who loved me, making sure I would be standing on solid ground long after he was gone. Nobody gets to decide that doesn't count anymore just because they need something. I still deadhead the roses on the front porch. Still drink my coffee at the kitchen table most mornings with Raymond's chipped mug on the second shelf where I can see it. The spare bedroom is a guest room now. My granddaughter slept there for a week last summer, and I put up with the noise and the mess, and every second of it was exactly what a house is supposed to sound like. Some mornings I stand in the doorway of the living room and I think about the woman sitting on that couch with folded laundry in her hands, being told she was tolerated in her own home. I think about how close I came to letting panic and grief make the decision for me, to signing something, to giving up the ground beneath me just to stop the discomfort of conflict. I think about Raymond saying, "Call Walter before you do anything else." I think about how love, real love, shows up not only in what you give, but in what you protect. If you're listening to this and you recognize something in it, if there's a pressure in your life disguised as a family conversation, if you've been told your history doesn't count, if someone is measuring your value by what you're willing to surrender, please hear this. You are allowed to say no. You're allowed to call the lawyer. You're allowed to walk back inside and lock the door. Staying quiet to keep the peace is only peace for the people who benefit from your silence. I am Gloria, and this is what happened in my house. My house. Here on Lunar Tales, we believe that the stories women were told to swallow deserve to be heard. If this reached you, if it reminded you of someone you love or of yourself on a harder day, then it did what it was meant to do. Subscribe to Lunar Tales so you don't miss what's coming next. And if you have a story of your own, one you were told was too late or too small to matter, know that it isn't. It never was. I thought a lot about what made Philip so certain he would win. It wasn't stupidity. He was a capable man in many ways. What undid him was something simpler and harder to see from the inside. He had confused my patience with passivity. He had watched me stay quiet through dinners and phone calls and one uncomfortable conversation after another, and he had read the quiet as weakness. That was his error. Not the loan, not the pressure, not even the voicemail he left that Walter would later use as documentation. The error was the assumption. Once you decide someone isn't capable of protecting themselves, you stop watching what they're actually doing. My daughter made a version of the same mistake. Though I hold her differently in my heart, she knew me. She had 30 years of evidence that I was not a woman who folded easily, and she set that evidence aside because it was more convenient to need me than to respect me. That's the part that took me the longest to sit with. Not the anger of it, but the sadness. When someone who loves you chooses convenience over your dignity, the wound is quieter than betrayal and harder to name. What I know now, standing on the other side of it, is that character isn't built in the moments when things are easy. Philip's character revealed itself the second he started calculating the value of my home against the cost of treating me decently. My daughter's revealed itself the moment she let him, and mine. I'd like to think mine revealed itself in the pause between their pressure and my response, in a decision not to react from panic, in the call to Walter. In the 34 years Raymond and I spent building something solid enough to withstand exactly this. Raymond understood something I've been learning my whole life, that integrity compounds. Every decision you make honestly, every boundary you hold without bitterness, every year you spend building rather than taking, it adds up. It doesn't always protect you from hardship, but it gives you something to stand on when hardship arrives. He couldn't know what form the threat would take. He just knew that love, real love, builds toward the future instead of mortgaging it. I think about that now when I'm out with the roses in the morning, the choices we make when no one is watching, the preparations we put in place when the need feels hypothetical. Those are the ones that matter most. Not because life rewards the careful, though sometimes it does. Because living with intention means that even in the worst moments, you are still yourself. No one can take that from you with a leather portfolio and a deadline. If there's anything I want to carry out of this story, it's that. Not the outcome. The outcome was Raymond's foresight, not my triumph. What's mine is the decision to make the call, to read the documents, to hold the line one more day when holding it was exhausting. That part was earned. Gloria made her choice one quiet morning at a kitchen table. You get to make yours, too.